AB InBev is world's largest brewer, and despite the fact that they employ over 200,000 people, their hiring process is as a well-kept secret as maybe as their beer recipes. So in this video I'm going to take a closer look at how they hire, and probably even more interesting for my audience, what are they looking for in new recruits. While AB InBev hires diverse people, as a large business they must ensure that each and every new hire is a great cultural fit. And in fact, CEO Carlos Brito, whenever he makes a corporate speech, he references at least one of what AB InBev calls its 10 principles. So no matter for what types of jobs you're applying at AB InBev, there will be at least a few questions about these 10 principles. So next I'm going to give you some more insight into what each of them really means with some examples, and actually I'll group them into sections so it will be easier to go through them. So the whole management philosophy at AB InBev is driven by this concept of a dream, and Carlos Brito sees this dream as a more efficient way to organize the organization as compared to just calling it as a core value, because this dream is used as a main method to motivate groups of people and essentially high-performing teams. Also interesting to note here is that Carlos Brito sees a company as basically a group of great people. So long as you have the correct policies in place and you use them to motivate those people, you do have a strong shot at keeping this lead. Also important to see here is that they see this leadership position as a journey instead of a destination. So in other words, you can never reach that dream, but you could always do your best and re-emphasize around your principles to make sure that at least you're on the wrong path. And maybe finally an example here that Carlos Brito gave with an athlete, that if you don't sufficiently motivate an athlete, for example, to jump to a certain height, if you put the bar too low, then there will be no motivation to get over that bar. But instead, if you put it reasonably high, then that athlete will do his best and try to pass it, and then you put it higher and higher. And this is the mindset that people at AB InBev should favor. Now, the other ingredient to achieve that dream that I mentioned in the first principle is to have the best people. And for this, you must really have to have processes in place to motivate those people. Because another example from CEO is the only thing that you cannot really copy from a beer company in the beer industry is actually the people, because if you launch a new product, your competitors will eventually, if successful, they could clone it in a matter of months. But having great people, that's a lot harder to copy. And another reason why having great people is so important is because great people attract more of the same, and great people in great teams challenge themselves to basically perfection, to these types of behaviors. Now, by contrast, if you have average people, they also attract more of the same, and they will eventually like to institute smaller goals that can easily be reached, and this will actually result in an average company. And last but not least to this principle is that AB InBev hires quite a lot from universities, because they believe in forming people from the early beginnings, and this mentality is their best shot to achieve this goal of hiring and retaining great people. The next two principles are around ownership and leadership by example. And to give an example here from Carlos Brito again, if you rent a car, your sense of ownership is a lot smaller than if you own it. So if you rent it, you're a lot more likely to go over speed bumps, and it's quite unheard of to get a rental car to a car wash. And as some people say, don't be gentle, it's a rental. So this is the contrast that allows to better highlight that sense of ownership that's highlighted in this principle. And maybe another example here is one of managing company money. And for instance, if you have that sense of ownership, you will more likely choose to spend your company money as your own money. So instead of just picking the most expensive hotel, you will most likely get a more value balanced approach here. So I believe these two examples are quite good to make you get a feel of what this ownership mentality is all about. And of course, leadership by example goes without saying that by behaving this way, you also lead by example to within your own group and organization. This next principles is actually quite easy to explain. It's focusing around zero complacency and basically keep going towards reaching that level of excellence and perfection. And how you do this? Well, you do this by essentially choosing a few fights, to pick up a few areas of interest and focus on them and do them really well. Because as Carlos Brito says as well, you cannot focus on too many things at once. So you should definitely pick up your fights, just 2 or 3 up to 5 things that you could do, and do them really well, as opposed to having a very vague and general approach. Common sense and simplicity are usually preferred as to unnecessary complications. And to give an example here, when you have a presentation, when somebody has to do a presentation for you, and they start developing on those slides, and maybe they have many slides with different colors and many complex charts, essentially, that's not a particularly good sign when it comes to their ability to synthesize, to make things simple and natural to understand. So you should have this inclination towards simplicity, and keep in mind that it tends to be that the simple things are often the most relevant and have the best impact. This next principle is quite important for AB InBev, that is the ability to manage costs tightly. And to give an example from Carlos Brito here, if we associate the company with a black box, the only way that you could make deposits into that black box is through sales revenue. But on the other hand, the way that you could make withdrawals from it would be either through the operating cost that is running the cost of a business, either through the investment, making investments in that business. And the only fixed known numbers from these equations are the running costs and the investment costs. So Carlos Brito strongly believes in the concept of AB InBev being a frugal company. In other words, if you manage those two fixed costs tightly, this is the best way to ensure that you stay fit, because the future is quite uncertain and it's only the fittest that will survive. Also important here is the idea that they see themselves as a meritocracy. In other words, they spend money responsibly during the year, so in order to give dividends and at the end of the year. So these are the two main elements that you should be aware of and be able to reflect throughout your interviewing process. And finally, to never take shortcuts and to always favor a culture of hard work is also something very dear to AB InBev. And they actually say that we love owners, but we hate professionals and executives. And why would they have such an approach? Well, because they believe that an executive has the main goal of getting a job just in order to build a greater CV, when by contrast an owner takes pride in their job and essentially contributes day by day to the success of a company, and also feels that sense of a higher purpose. Now, also important to know here is that AB InBev therefore chooses to hire the vast majority of its workforce through university recruiting programs. So they see these elements of this ownership culture as the main element to drive that first principle of the dream. AB InBev hires many trainees, and this usually happens through one of their special programs. And actually, these programs are what makes hiring at AB InBev quite unique. Now, despite the fact that many of these people come from various parts of the world, the hiring process does have a similarly looking structure with up to 7 steps. So this first step of the application almost always happens online, and essentially consists of filling in a set of forms, up to 10 screens, with the more basic information about yourself. The second step of the application process basically consists of some online tests, which could be some personality profiles, could be even some online games meant to test your cognitive abilities. And for some people, for international recruits, there could also be an English test. Next, if successful from the previous steps, there will be a video interview that, if you're lucky, will be with a real person, but otherwise there will be a passive interview that will just ask you to pre-record some answers to some questions. So the next step is usually the ABI assessment day, which is often a multi-day event, the first day being the networking event, and then the second day with the actual interview. And they might also give you a bit of role-playing exercise, their business games, and it's essentially an interviewing process to assess you as a cultural fit inside the company. And then the final step would be the panel interview, which, by the way, is a great thing, which is a set of one-on-one interviews that again will test you as a fit inside AB InBev, and will be with some higher ups from the company. And then, if successful, there will be a formal offer. Now, the content of each interviewing step and basically the type of assessments that you will receive actually vary by geographic position. So one way here to investigate further will be to check them out on Glassdoor. Just be sure to check for the specific position that you're applying, as well as your given location. So as any large business, AB InBev puts a lot of emphasis on hiring for cultural fit, and as most of their hires come from trainee programs, it's very important you understand that your time is a lot less valuable than their time. And to give an example here, as I earlier mentioned during the video interview, if you're lucky, you're going to have a real person on the other end, but more often than not, there will be an automated video interview that will ask you to record your questions. So it's very important that you understand this, the formalities when proceeding with such an interview. Also, another method that they use to ensure that they only hire the right people for them is to structure their hiring process into as many as 7 steps. And for each of these steps, they will test you for something. For example, during the personality profiling, there will be that personality screening interview that is quite important. And here probably the main thing you may not know is this: the personality profiling tools are almost never used as a disqualifier for somebody. They are just used to understand your personality better. Now, if you want some examples of personality profiling tools, here are two of them with the two most common types of personality profiling tools. First is the Myers-Briggs, and the second one is based on the Big Five. Now, there's also likely going to be some game-based assessment tool, and for this, here is an example of such a game. It's a free registration, and again, I'm not saying that they will use these tests, but these tests will give you a great idea of what's involved here and what do they mean by testing your cognitive abilities. And here are two more examples of situational judgment and logical reasoning tests. Now, during the ABI assessment, you may be asked to prepare a presentation, which will most likely be a commercial presentation. For instance, how would you market a fictive brand with a given amount of money in a specific market? And here are some actual examples of specific questions during the interview. And maybe a final idea here, during the final rounds of your interviews, I believe it would be a highly efficient strategy to also prepare a few stories about, let's say, your greatest accomplishments, of how you see your best career path, or even your greatest failure. So anyway, the idea would be to prepare these stories as the main highlights of your career or in your life if you don't already have a career. But and the reason why I'm saying these are very important, because they will help you to more easily connect the dots with a behavioral question that you're likely going to be asked during the panel interview, for instance, than if you will have to spend all those extra brain cycles to remember all those memories, and then spend a lot amount of time to just simply remember the facts, when you could spend that very important time on actually phrasing your response into a more narrative format. So also interesting to know here is one way that you could phrase your answers is using the STAR method. That is to first present the situation that you're describing, then the tasks that you're required to perform, and this could go hand in hand in some cases. Then you should explain the actions that you took, and finally the resolve of that situation. But again, the main thing here is to prepare some stories in a very narrative format. Even if you spend 1 hour writing only for one story, it will greatly help you to better get over the behavioral questioning part of your interview. And by the way, don't forget to also prepare some questions that you could ask AB InBev maybe as a closing note, or even if they might as well ask you if you have any questions for them. And one method here is to use the 4 C's method, into which I'll give you here 4 areas to think of where the more interesting questions could arise. Now, it usually takes around 1 month, but this could vary according to your location. So it's usually 1 week until you hear back from after you submit your initial online application. They use a software that's called montage interviewing software. Well, it usually takes 1 year, and that is until the next season, right? Well, definitely not on their website, but I believe that Glassdoor would be a great point to start. So overall, I find the AB InBev's hiring process as quite efficient and highly structured, which I believe is a good thing. Now, there are some steps, namely the automated video interviewing step, that I believe bring little to no value to their hiring process. However, I believe they are catching up with the latest HR trends. So that's pretty much it. I hope you found this information useful, and thank you very much for watching.